Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 110th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. This video, I'd like to explore how paradigms and beliefs from the part of humanity influences our experience and especially influences our interactions with quote unquote the outside. That is not to say the the other physical elements of our universe, like for instance asteroids and stuff, but rather other consciousnesses. So let's get right to it. So you have Earth. Oops. Planet Earth. And on it, you have plenty of trees, mountains, oceans, plants, grass, animals. Now, what makes humans so special is that when you have enough humans on the planet, they create a kind of a protecting consciousness bubble around the planet, like a sort of a veil or a filter. Because whatever they believe, and the more humans there are on the planet, of course, the stronger that kind of shield. What they believe serves as a filter as to what can interact with planet Earth. When there are no humans on the planet, so before there are any humans, animals do not have a mental filter for what can or cannot interact with them. They're very open. They just have their five senses open. Whatever comes into their reality, it's fine. It's not going to influence um, their behavior, or it's not going to skew things in terms of their evolution. But humans, very much so, because we can remember things and we can start creating ideas based on certain experiences. Like, for instance, if you witness something which is out of the ordinary, you might interpret that as being the act of gods in the sky. That is not the case for animals. They'll just try to find a sort of a basic reaction to whatever happens to them in order for ensuring their survival. So, for instance, if any interaction that is negative is followed or preceded by a very loud sound, then they will know that they should flee. If any interaction is something nice and enjoyable, then they'll be attracted to that based on the kind of sensory feedback they get. And so, when there are no humans on the planet, you can have aliens, quote unquote, visiting the planet, no problem, going out of the planet, doing whatever they want. Once humans arrive on the planet or are born kind of on the planet, and once they reach a certain level of consciousness, the barrier they create, the shield that they create around the planet in terms of their belief and their paradigm, is extremely strong. Becomes stronger and stronger. And this shield is stronger and stronger depending on the how should I say, the number of humans in the network. And the strength of their beliefs. So the more humans are on the planet, so when you have only like a tribe, first of all, the early belief systems of humans were quite broad. That is, they didn't exclude, they were not excluding beliefs. That is, they didn't say what could not happen. They only said what they believe is happening based on, like, for instance, spirits and animals and all that stuff. But they were still very much open in terms of what can enter into their into their reality. That's the first thing. So they were not exclusive. They were rather not inclusive, but they were not excluding any kind of experience. They just started to form a kind of belief and paradigm system that was based on, animistic beliefs and spirits and all that. And so if you have higher dimensions, which have a form which is beyond our understanding, because it is something beyond our imagination, it is something that is beyond our five senses, and therefore, because we are in time, space, matter, and all that stuff, and we come from biology, what is higher than us is the world of ideas, which in the absolute have no form. An idea does not have a form. For instance, what shape has democracy? What color does it have? What shape does justice have? And so you understand that ideas are born in the minds of humans, and that is our bridge between the material world, biology and all that stuff, physics, chemistry, and the dimensions above us, which is ideas and what is beyond ideas, what is beyond thought, beyond imagination. And that is even higher. And when these dimensions want to enter into contact with us, they need to take on a specific form. Now, so long as there are no humans around, they can just shape light into whatever form they want, because there is no filter, no bubble, no consciousness bubble here that they have to pierce in order to enter into that reality. So animals, for instance, they don't care if aliens appear to them as in a saucer, or as just pure light that descends on the planet and flashing about, or as a spirit, or they just don't care. And so when there is no bubble, these higher dimensions, beings or consciousnesses that are from those higher dimensions, they're kind of like conscious thought, if you want, or conscious idea, or even what is beyond that, consciousness beyond ideas. They can take whatever form they want in order to interact with those, but they cannot necessarily interact with animals and stuff in a physical sense. Because otherwise they would have to build their form from the ground up, based on the same rules that apply to this. So, for instance, if you have like the layer of physics here, then the layer of chemistry, then the level of biology, then the level of us humans, which is biology conscious of itself, which starts to go into ideas that can manifest. But everything still has to go through all of this process, because that is how this reality is built. And so if they want to interact with animals, for instance, in a very physical sense, they would still have to use this kind of structure to interact with them. Well, before they're humans and before they structure their reality in that sense, maybe aliens could still interact with them, but that is a reality that we have never experienced as humans. It is the reality that you would find in like myths and stuff, where there were still unicorns about and various magical creatures and all that stuff. And besides, previous to the existence of humans, then you had also Atlantis. You had also Lemuria. You had ancient Egypt. And each of these civilizations created its own filter bubble and its own kind of structuring of the layers, different layers of reality, for other consciousnesses to sort of build themselves and give themselves a form based on that. And so Atlantis had another understanding of reality, which would allow for creatures from higher dimensions to structure themselves based on what the Atlanteans understood of reality and how they structured reality. And physics, chemistry, and biology can be seen as like, if you have a scale, for instance, and kind of notes here on the piano. Of course, I'm not drawing this accurately, but you get the idea. It's as if us humans, Homo sapiens, decided that we're going to choose to structure reality physics, chemistry, and biology. And maybe the Atlanteans, they decided to structure their reality by using vibrations, crystals, and I don't know what. And so their reality is completely different than our reality today, here. And maybe this is like our bubble of consciousness. This is their bubble of reality consciousness. And then in between, you can have a few things that are compatible. Like you could find archaeological ruins, because ultimately, if they're using rock to build their cities, then we would maybe find like, some things buried in the ground. But there is so much from their civilization that we would never see, because it's totally incompatible with the way that we build and structure reality from the ground up, from basically pure light that can take any kind of form to a light that takes on a form based on certain very detailed and precise rules like physics, chemistry, biology, and stuff. And so when a UFO sort of swings in here, and I'm going to draw it like this, but it's formless in the end, or they have their own kind of form, which has nothing to do with saucers necessarily. If there's this point of entry here where they can take on a specific form and interact with the Atlanteans, that form that they're going to take is going to be unique to make it compatible with the way that the Atlanteans see the world. And if that same UFO were to interact with humans, then they would have to go through another kind of gate or filter, which is the filter of our own consciousness and ideas and paradigms and beliefs. And so even if it's the same consciousness, the same conscious thought or idea or higher being from higher dimensions, it will take on two different forms because it enters into a different paradigm. Once, of course, it has to interact with humans and dealing with humans, because before they're humans, like I said, it can take on any form, but then it's not sure how it can interact with animals. And that kind of reality, in any case, is magical in its nature anyway. So you could have just about anything going on as far as animals, and that's probably also maybe what explains the huge diversity in the world of biology, is because before there are humans around, you can basically do whatever you want. There's nothing, no consciousness to kind of limit things or try to understand things or try to place limiting beliefs on things and structure and categorize things and make things so orderly, which is why reality resembles more like a chaotic dream, very interesting, but not as solid, material, stable, continuous, which is basically what humans are for. That is our purpose, is to structure reality, is to make reality denser. Because without humans, without this filter bubble, sure, these higher dimension consciousnesses can then mess around with reality and create all kinds of plants, all kinds of animals. But the experience isn't as solid, as or should I say, as strong, as stable, as continuous, as progressive. For instance, you wouldn't have billions and billions of years of evolution of experience. You just have like, I don't know, a couple of Earth years before everything just turned to chaos, and then you start over. You try new things. So let's move on a bit. So let's say, okay, so you have the animist beliefs in the earlier tribes. And of course, when you have a tribe, its influence on the planet only extends as far as the tribal, where the tribe perceives. For instance, if there's only a tribe on this side of the planet, then the UFOs can, of course, visit this side and take any form they want because it's outside of the influence of this consciousness bubble. So they're not forced into taking a specific form. They can do whatever they want still. But once that enters into contact with the consciousness bubble of humans, then whatever they create, like for instance, imagine that they create a chimera here, or a unicorn, or any kind of magical beast like a dragon. And that dragon, I always hesitate to draw something because I'm such a bad drawer. Okay, let's say they create a dragon. And that dragon interacts with the consciousness bubble or paradigm or belief system of the humans. If the humans cannot make sense of that, or their beliefs are very strong in the non-existence of that dragon based on their paradigm, then that dragon would basically disappear or vanish like a dream. Or they vanquish the dragon with bows and arrows because they believe that's going to help because the dragon is just like any other animal. And then that works as well. You can get rid of the dragon that was created by other higher dimensional beings at the other side of the planet, thanks to a belief system that if it looks like an animal, then you can kill it like any other animal. And that's where you get, I think, all of your mythologies and stories about weird things happening on the planet, giants and all that stuff. It's when the human collective was still very young and you had only tribes of humans on the planet, then they didn't have a grip on what was created on the planet, what kind of forms existed on the planet via a comprehensive consciousness or belief system or paradigm kind of bubble or filter. But as the beliefs sort of consolidated, for instance, you move to polytheism, and especially since the ideas of ancient Greece, for instance, and the Greek philosophers, then reality already became much more material and physical. Because it's the Greeks that formulated this idea of the atom, or the atoma, as like a tiny structure which is at the center of like a building block for all matter. It is the Greeks also that formulated plenty of other ideas like geometry and all that stuff. And those ideas were then present in the whole collective, even if unconsciously, moving towards monotheism. And if you recall, for instance, Plato wrote a book about visiting Atlantis. But the consciousness of humanity from ancient Greece onwards evolved in such a way that it sort of erased traces of many of other magical or weird things that were happening on the planet, because it moved away from this area that is in between, that is compatible, became smaller and smaller until eventually, the bubbles were no longer in contact with each other. And so you cannot find any more evidence of visiting Atlantis or any evidence of being there being unicorns on the planet or dragons or whatever, because it contradicts the vision of or the understanding of reality of humans. And don't forget also that from ancient Greece onwards, the human population only increased exponentially as time goes by. And so ancient Greece, and then it just steadily grows and grows and grows. And of course, the more it grows, the more our reality becomes more and more stable, and the less you hear stories of weird things happening on the planet. Now, with monotheism, higher consciousnesses could basically only take the form of um, some of these, saints or whatever, like Jesus or um, angels, or any creatures that were basically inside the Bible. And so, if you had a quote unquote negative consciousness that had negative intents towards Earth, um, today, with our paradigm, we could call them reptilians or whatever. They would take on the form of reptilians because it's compatible with our view of reality. But in those days, it would be like something like the devil, or whatever humans would imagine is the devil. Um, so don't forget that basically this is like a bubble of energy, conscious vibrations that creates an interface on top of those vibrations, and that interface consolidates the more humans are on the planet. And on the outside, you also have vibrations, of course, but that's also an interface. They have their own interface. But when they want to enter into contact or interact with these vibrations, they're kind of forced to penetrate into the interface, because the interface basically rejects and excludes anything that is not compatible with it, with its own interface. And it's the same if you have a computer basically running, a certain operating system, like say Windows or whatever. If on the outside you have another computer that is running Linux and it wants to interact and it plugs into this computer, then it has to make itself compatible with the Windows interface. And if in the Windows interface there is no point of entry for anything coming from the outside, then there is no interaction possible. And so monotheism, its point of entry for coming into contact with other consciousnesses is through these higher dimensional creatures, which have a specific form: Jesus, angels, devil, whatever. And the reason this UFOs, for instance, the UFO phenomenon, was strongest in the 1950s is because the human imagination, when humans saw more and more sophisticated flying airplanes and all that stuff, and as humans read sci-fi literature, and as humans saw the potential for launching rockets, especially after Hitler came up with rocket technology, and the Russians sent Sputnik into space, then suddenly for the human consciousness and the human collective, it suddenly became envisageable or possible that other beings or other creatures from other planets could actually come to visit them. And the human collective gave them whatever form was most compatible with their idea of a spaceship or vessel. And so I would always find it weird that, for instance, if you have in sci-fi literature, the first sci-fi people that illustrate UFOs paint it like a saucer, and then indeed when aliens come, people say they saw a saucer. I find it weird, of course, but it's no coincidence, because it's the only form that is allowed, quote unquote, for these higher dimensional beings to take in order to penetrate the interface of humans. And the reason why, for instance, they talk about a crash in Roswell and all that stuff is because higher dimensional beings, if they come into our bubble of consciousness, they have to assume a form which is compatible with the interface that humanity is running. But that means taking on all kinds of limitations that are, to them, weird quirks. So, for instance, if they choose to see reality and experience reality and structure reality in a completely different way than we do, like, for instance, choose this note, and this note, and that is their reality, their way of experiencing reality, and they have to find something to convert their way of structuring reality with ours in order to come and interact with us. If they don't understand the way that we look at physics, chemistry, biology, and how what we think is possible or impossible in terms of our laws of thermodynamics, our laws of conservation of energy, our laws of how the physical reality works, then the form that they're going to take is going to be extremely weak or fragile, because if they don't get it right, then their vessel will basically malfunction and they'll crash. And they'll be forced to take on a vulnerable physical, biological form, because that is the only way their consciousness could survive in our interface. Because that is the only thing that we think is possible in our reality. Like, we cannot imagine that a creature could survive without a body. And so their consciousnesses are trapped by our paradigm that controls our reality. And so it takes a while for them to get it right, and especially they have to be sort of patient that our understanding of technology and all of these different layers advances to the point where they can take on a form which isn't dangerous to them, because we would basically, it's almost like if we sabotaged the form that they take via our belief system, which is incompatible with their flying saucer being able to remain in flight, because it violates so many laws. But the problem is, the more they wait, the more also the idea that contacts with aliens is impossible, because it would take them, you cannot go faster than the speed of light. It would take them, I don't know how many years, and they would already be here. Therefore, we must be alone in the universe. This is an idea like the Fermi paradox, which is very prevalent now in the minds of most people. And whereas in the 1950s, how many people were aware of the limitations or the obstacles for these higher dimensional beings or aliens to come and visit us? Not many people were saying, "Oh no, that's impossible. People, we cannot receive a visit from extraterrestrials because the closest star is this many light years away, and you cannot travel faster than the speed of light." And blah blah blah. People weren't that educated, or they didn't have those kinds of limiting beliefs, which means that between the 1930s, so to speak, and the 1970s or 80s, there was a window for contact which was very wide, but still very dangerous for these higher dimensional beings, because our consciousness was still very limited as to the kinds of forms that they would be allowed to take to interact with us, entering into our interface. So it's as if Windows evolved just enough for Linux to be able to enter using some very basic commands. But then once Linux enters into Windows, then it says, "Oh my God, I'm in a straitjacket. I cannot do this and this and this and that. I didn't anticipate that." And then it's kind of stuck there, and can only leave once Windows evolves, or via simply death, and then you just just like us, we leave our bodies, and then of course we can transition to another interface once we die. But there's no way for them to conserve, like just go back to their original interface without going through the process of death. Like, for instance, transitioning out of their biological bodies into their light bodies or whatever, still inside our interface. They have to conform to the rules of the interface. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, and this is very important, is that the paradigm that we are under today science, scientific materialism, is forms this kind of veil or consciousness bubble or paradigm bubble that we are in, or interface bubble, which makes sure that nothing quirky ever enters into this reality. And it's quite strong, that kind of shield. Now, you could call it a magnetic shield that shields us from, solar radiation or whatever, solar storms, all kinds of information that comes from outer space. But it's the same thing, basically. Um, it is a kind of a shield. It's electromagnetic and magnetic in nature. It's almost as if humans basically influence via their beliefs the magnetic shield, the natural magnetic shield of Earth, and that filters out. That is the filter that filters out the interactions with other things trying to enter into our planet. It's not that we produce necessarily the magnetic shield, but we definitely interact with the magnetic shield and then give it certain properties. Like, filter out this, please, and filter out that, please, because we don't believe in UFOs, and it's impossible to come here because speed of light, blah blah blah. But so this belief system of humans in science, it creates an egregore or a thought form, which is very much alive. Like, it's almost like a god. It's almost like a huge entity or being that always watches reality, watches everything that's happening on reality, and makes sure that it is self-consistent with the belief in science. Now, in the very beginnings of science, in the 18th, 19th century, for instance, you had a lot of different competing models and no consensus. And when scientists were running experiments, most of them didn't already have a preconceived idea of what they think they will find. Sometimes they were just testing things. They weren't as hard, they weren't as formatted as to what is and isn't possible. And so in those days, you could have contradicting and conflicting results for experiences because there wasn't a consensus, and this thought form wasn't very strong and powerful. So when you have competing beliefs, they basically, cancel each other out. And so you don't have, you can still have plenty of weird things happening on the planet. But of course, that is compatible with the older belief that is still in place, which is monotheism. So monotheism was another kind of thought form, and that one weakened and weakened until it became very, very weak, and it had almost no more influence on reality and filtering out things on reality. And then the science thought form took over at some point. The reason I'm explaining this, and the reason it's really important, is because, and this is what happened with the coronavirus. If you remember, in the early days of the coronavirus, it would seem, for instance, that Africa was less affected than other continents. And if you read what was being said in the press in those days, is that it was not normal, and that it was just a matter of time, and that there must be some kind of explanation or whatever. And so it's as if the collective belief in science, in materialist science, creates a thought form that watches over everything, every human experience happening on the planet. And if you are within its radar, then it will almost force upon you what that thought form believes is reality, is possible in that reality. So if you have a bunch of Africans here that are much more used to dealing with diseases and much less panicky about viruses and stuff, because they've suffered from so many things, from Ebola and all that stuff. So they have a different outlook on life and diseases. They're still kind of not totally inside and don't buy totally into this paradigm of material science. They could have they could have potentially experienced this coronavirus in a completely unique way that has nothing to do from the way that Europeans or Americans or other countries experienced the coronavirus. But since this thought form is so powerful and we are now so interconnected, it's almost, it's the same phenomenon as the Pygmalion effect. I don't know if that you say that also in English, but it's basically this experiment that was done in a classroom where you had students, like children, and then the belief that the teacher hold about the students influenced their grades. So if you told the teacher that the students were all dumb as a board, then sure enough, once the teacher would collect their grades, the way that he would teach, his attitude towards the students would manifest his beliefs, because the students and the children were so malleable, basically, so vulnerable to the belief projections, the projections that the teacher had on the children. So just picture this in your mind. Imagine if a teacher enters into a classroom and that teacher believes that children are restless, and cannot, you need to tame them by force and all that stuff. And it has that attitude where it watches the children aggressively. How long do you think it'll take for those children to display precisely the type of behavior that validates what the teacher believes? Not very long. And so you can imagine the thought form that is created by humanity, the belief in material science, as being a kind of severe school teacher that is watching every single one of his children, being, individual humans, and with a certain belief that all of them are the same. They're all going to behave in the same way because they're all, spoiled brats or whatever. And so anything that is inconsistent with that is put under severe pressure from this thought form to manifest that kind of reality. Also, the second thing is in the mass media, for instance, when the coronavirus first appeared, some people were saying it's just a mild flu, and some people said it was a pandemic. And the way that science works is that we're very quick to jump to conclusions nowadays. And of course, some scientists reached the conclusion that it was a mild flu based on their preliminary statistics and findings, and the same for other teams that believed that it was a pandemic. And what did the mass media mostly focus on? What story? That it was a pandemic or that it was a mild flu? And so if you are listening to the mass media and you are listening to what the collective is saying, and the collective and the mass media are saying that the coronavirus's symptoms are this and this and this and this and that, then once you come into contact with it, you're bound to develop those symptoms in one way or another, because you've bought into the collective experience of what they believe are the symptoms. And of course, they could be those, but they could also be something totally different for you because you're a unique individual. But it's as if, imagine each human is a different vibration, a different note, because we're all different. And the coronavirus, it's almost as if you would align your vibration, you would transform your vibration in a way that would manifest these symptoms, because the thought form decided that this event, which is the coronavirus, this energy that is coming into the planet, will take on this specific form with these specific symptoms, with these specific effects. and everybody should experience it in the same way. And that's quite crazy, but still, it of course it has um, many different many different reasons for that happening. Of course, for us to become aware of this effect, for us to experience, for us to be really given a choice of being a collective, or realizing that we are a collective planet, that we are a one planet, one collective global organism, because the coronavirus affected every single country, and the variants now seem to ignore borders. Even if people start closing down borders, they still get these variants that come in through one way or another. So the lesson is, you are a collective global consciousness. There's no way that you can think that your experience is disconnected from the experiences of other beings, other humans on the planet. And now you have to make a choice of whether you want to go forward with that realization that you're one global collective consciousness and global organism, or not. And this choice, I believe, mirrors the first choice of a baby, the first conscious choice of a baby. That is, when the baby develops in the womb, it's basically an automatic process, very calibrated, and everything happens, in a set way. But then comes the moment of birth. And birth is the first event where I believe the baby has a first conscious choice that it can make. And it can make a choice to be born alive as a global collective organism, or dead as a stillbirth. And if you have a stillbirth, like an abortion or whatever, how do you call that, when you just lose your baby before the 9 months term, when that happens, that is an unconscious choice. That is, it is not the baby from its conscious perspective that decides to be to leave the body of the mother, but it's at a higher level, a higher dimensional level, that happens. Like the soul decides to say, okay, screw it, I'm not coming in the end, or for whatever reasons. But the first conscious choice that is being made is birth, how birth happens, how quickly, and whether the baby wants to come out alive or dead. And we are faced with the same choice, basically. And these events, whether it's the coronavirus, climate change, or whether we have an economic and financial crises and all kinds of other events happening, is for us to sort of force us to make a conscious choice. Okay, do we want to be born alive? Do we recognize that we are a collective global organism, that every human is just part of one big collective global organism? And do we want to be born alive as one? And that means becoming conscious of this whole process that I'm explaining right now, and allowing for all kinds of different thought forms to coexist peacefully and play their role of structuring reality without being a forceful kind of mechanism, or do we ignore this whole process and pretend that this doesn't exist, and then we'll remain in the illusion of separation? But then, of course, that story is the story of a total collapse of our civilization, where only a few million people survive on a planet that is that live like cavemen, basically, because all technology and also like civilization basically crumbled. And that is a possibility, of course, but very slim in my mind, because of the point that we've reached. I just don't see why people would collectively choose that kind of future. I believe that people have already chosen unconsciously individually, unconsciously, that they want to be born. That is, our collective global organism is conscious that it wants to be born collectively as a global organism that is alive. But the individual parts of that organism are not necessarily yet consciously aware of that choice that they've made individually in their hearts. If not consciously through their belief system, then unconsciously through the way they feel about the future, about humanity. Like, for instance, we still have children. We still have hope for the future and a better future. We still imagine us going to Mars and all kinds of things. We still have hope. And so that means that that hope basically just reflects, then becomes this, transforms into this conscious decision of the global organism from its perspective that it wants to be born alive. And then it just has to permeate into the consciousness of each individual human for them to realize, yeah, actually, I want to be born alive as part of this global collective organism. I recognize that that's what's happening, and I'm conscious of all of this. And so that means that basically, it's like, imagine if this science thought form was the lungs, this was the stomach, like for instance, monotheism was the stomach, and you had the flu, then the lungs cannot dictate to the rest of the organs how they should experience the flu. That's ridiculous. Every organ, every cell in the body experiences a disease in a unique fashion, but what they do have in common is solidarity. That is, every organ helps every other organ recover because they understand that they're interdependent. But no organ dictates how another organ should experience a certain disease. And each organ, each cell does what it's supposed to do and what it does best in order to fight that disease. It doesn't suddenly transform itself, and like the stomach cells don't transform themselves into the immune system cells to fight off a disease. They just do what they do best, what they're meant to do. And the same for our planet, basically, the same for our humans. Ultimately, also, the lesson for this coronavirus and the whole vaccine thing is the same thing. It is, again, there is no way that you can just implement one idea, one thing, one solution, one size fits all to everyone. Everybody has to have the same symptoms. Everybody has to have the same vaccine. Everybody has to do this and that. That is, we're experiencing by the negative a sort of a caricature of the thought form that we've created of science to be made aware of it, so that we are aware of it, that it exists, and that we can transform it via our collective awareness of it. Because right now we're feeding that thought form. Scientists are feeding that thought form unconsciously. They're not understanding that they're actually creating it and limiting human experience via their limited beliefs. Nowadays, when scientists make experiments, what do you think? Do you think that most scientists, when they make their experiments, do you think that they do them and they have no idea what the outcome will be? Or they already have a very definite idea of what is possible and impossible, of what the outcome is going to be? Most scientists nowadays have structured reality in their minds in such a strong way, their belief systems are so closed-minded, that when they do an experiment, they're pretty much already sure of the result. Then what's the point? What's the point of doing an experiment if you already know what the result is and you just need confirmation? And that is what is happening right now with the coronavirus, for instance, with all kinds of things. It's just a self-consistent system that is now closed for any kind of meaningful evolution, and the only evolution is through quantum, this idea of the quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and all that stuff. But that breaks the system so badly that there's a resistance, because if you take these quantum reasonings to their extreme, then you end up in a Deepak Chopra kind of reality where consciousness creates everything and everything is possible. And that is too much of a leap. It's like completely removing the barrier and fine, actually, anything is possible. Infinity, the sky's the limit, or the sky's not the limit. You can go beyond the sky and whatever. You can materialize things with your thoughts if you want to, but we're not ready for that. We're not ready for that kind of interactions. It's like if once a baby is born, you immediately put them in a chair of you send them to run a big company, and you appoint them as CEO, and you put them in a business chair, and you say, okay, here's the accounting, here's the computer, and the baby is just there in the chair screaming, not understanding what's happening to it. When the baby is born, it's actually surrounded by only a certain number of consciousnesses in a very safe environment, limited environment. It is not exposed to the outside world and the planet and the stars and everything instantly. Its consciousness is not overloaded by all of these things. It gradually sort of expands into that with the protective bubble of its mother, father, and all that stuff. And that same principle applies to us. That is, we have to gradually open up our model, our thought form that is now completely cementing reality. That is the science materialism. We have to gradually open it up. It's like gradually taking off the wheels of the little bike so that you don't fall too often to one side or another. You don't take off the wheels and then put the kid on a mountain bike. You put it on a small bike that is of its size, and you make the kid go around in your garden where there's no slopes, where if it falls on the grass and it's not too painful. And the same for us. Now you have, for instance, what a scientist that I respect a lot is Nassim Haramein, that does all kinds of experiences and experiments which are still scientifically based, which is they're still limiting. They're not this quantum, anything is possible, and we live in just a sea of possibilities and of potential, which is infinite, blah, 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 which is true in the absolute, but then there's no experience and no structured experience or possible. And then you just revert back to the way it was when no humans walked the planet, and the planet was just like a big living dream of all kinds of things happening in chaos. And you give away the material, the quality and the intensity of this material experience that we have. And that would be a shame. Or, for instance, Rupert Sheldrake. All of these scientists propose new models which open up this closed material science paradigm a little bit, but not to the point where suddenly we can manifest things with our thoughts. And that is the way forward. But before we go to that, before we move on to that, I believe that it's time that we consciously become aware of this whole mechanism, so that we can actually choose, the choice again, in which direction we want to move, what kind of new thought form and new way of opening up our reality bubble or our interface we want to choose. Which one we prefer as humans. Because ultimately we should understand that while we've created a solid interface that filters out anything that comes from the outside, once we open it up, then we will have to own that experience that we have with the outside. So, for instance, if suddenly everybody is now convinced that there are evil reptilians out there that are controlling the planet, and that we've been under, inside a matrix trap, and blah, 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 blah. Do you think that is the best bridge or hole that we would create in the interface for all these outside experiences to kind of join us now in our physical reality? Do you think that is what we want? Is it what we want to experience? It's like a baby not knowing what he's going to find on the outside and thinking that his parents are a bunch of evil giants that are going to put him in the oven and cook him and eat him for dinner. Is that the best thought, the best kind of idea that a baby should have of his parents and what he's going to experience on the outside? Is that really the best belief that he should hold? And so basically, the choice that we're going to make in terms of the interface and opening up our interface is key, and it needs to be done consciously because it will determine the way that we're going to interact and experience interactions with other civilizations that have a different kind of structuring of the universe, such as what I've explained here. It's like almost like rejoining, for instance, with other bubbles and creating this bridge between the two. Where you create that bridge to interact with the others is essential, because that is what determines the experience you're going to have with the outside. And it might not be very wise or interesting to create a gap here where you would allow very negative experiences or negative beings or negative vibrations or whatever you want to say to enter into our reality and take physical form, or and so staying in an unconscious choice is not, I wouldn't say that is warranted at this point. I would say that now we have to make a conscious choice, and that also means that we have to recognize that if we choose, for instance, what Nassim Haramein is saying about reality, then it wouldn't be true. We have to move on from this idea of truth versus falsehood, but it would be the most wise choice for creating this interface, or this opening up our interface for experiencing interactions with the outside and also experiences on the planet which are adapted to our level of consciousness and which will be positive, have a positive net effect on humanity and on all of us. So sorry, this video was quite long, but I had a lot to say. So I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, of course, and talk to you in the next video.